Good morning, and it is incredibly empowering to be with all of these inspiring women. Our next story is so inspiring as well. Zhang joining us right now. Great to see you, Zhang.
Great to see you.
And we were watching that video. I want to talk right into it in terms of your empowering, inspiring story, because yours is incredibly optimistic for us and how you were able to rise from poverty in Beijing and growing up in the Cultural Revolution. Can you take us through your journey, your upbringing, and how it all happened?
So I was born during Cultural Revolution, when China was a socialist state, and literally no one had anything. We all lived on government-provided housing and pretty much rationed food. Then about 30, 40 years ago, China opened the door. People were beginning to leave China to get connected to the outside world. I was the lucky one to leave China. I first went to Hong Kong. I became a factory worker there for 5 years. And then eventually I went to England to get education, graduated from Cambridge University, and went to join Wall Street. Now you would have thought that life is pretty good there, right? I've decided that it was better for me to go back to my country and to join the building of the country. So after 15 years away from China, I went back. That was just 20 years ago, in the beginning of the whole urbanization process. So cities were literally being built. And before that, there was hardly any new buildings, high-rises, or new homes. And so for 20 years, we live in a world today that production and building of a city takes so much shorter time than before. In 20 years' time now, I look around that most cities in China are built. And during this time, not only I build the buildings, also build a company, build a family. I have 2 young boys, not so young, teenagers. So that's my story.
How wonderful. And they are actually calling you, and you've been called many times, the woman who built Beijing, which is incredibly extraordinary. But I want to get there, and we have some wonderful video of some of the buildings that you have built in terms of the architecture and how different they are, which we will get to. But first, how did you know that you could do this? I mean, you're being raised in this torturous, deadly era of Mao, and you actually rise out of it, and you believe you can rise and do well and become this titan that you have.
Well, to start with, I think anyone who lived in China in the 60s, 70s, or even early 80s, the only desire for Chinese is to leave China, because leaving China means better life, better education. And so I was no different from many other Chinese who had, when I had the opportunities, the first thing I did was to leave China. And when I left China, I realized outside world there's so much I could do. And first, obviously, was to get education. So when I was a factory worker in Hong Kong, every day I was thinking, how do I leave this place and to get education? And when Hong Kong was still the British colony, the place to go is to go to England to get education. And I remember I was going to the factory every day and trying to save money. Eventually, after 5 years, I saved about equivalent of 3,000 pounds sterling. And that was enough for me to leave the factories and move to the new country. Not new country, but to England. When I got there, I couldn't speak English, but I had 3,000 pounds. I figured that's enough to live. But very soon I realized that wasn't enough. I had to get a job. So I was learning English during the day, and weekends I would go to work for this little fish and chips store. You know, in England they have these fish and chips, right? I could only speak very limited English. So Friday evening, there used to be a long line waiting to buy fish and chips. And I would always ask people salt or vinegar, because that's what, do they want salt and vinegar? I kept on saying salt and vinegar the whole evening. So I sold a lot of fish and chips. And the owners were Chinese. They were very kind to me. They always say, pack some fish and chips home. So I used to eat so much in fish and chips, I can't eat fish and chips anymore now.
That is cute. That is terrific. But you know what really strikes me? The fact that there are so many billionaire females in China. Is there an encouragement, a movement? Why is it that there are so many strong, confident, and successful billionaire women in China?
I think one is China had no private economy 20 years ago, right? So when the economy offered the opportunity for people to build business, no one had money, no one had any experience. Men and women were starting from the same level. So I think women at that point still is being given an incredible opportunity to build business just like men would do. Whereas if I look around, like other countries, when you have a very developed economy, very established industries, then it becomes harder for women to penetrate into the industry. China's different. So that's why I think because it's such a new economy, new area, and it just offers almost equal opportunity to men and women.
But you have said to me in the past, your mother always encouraged it as well. She wanted you to move. She knew.
Yeah. So one thing, of all the horrible things you heard about Mao, one thing he did well was to raise the women's standard. He used to say women can raise half the sky. And so men and women all worked equally. When I grew up, my parents, I never heard about women don't work. Everybody worked. And men and women got equal pay, equal jobs, equal education. So that, I think, was good for Chinese women. My generation grew up in that environment, never thought that women could do any other thing but to work.
Back to your story, eventually you met your partner, you married, and you created Soho China under the idea that people would work and live in the same building. I want to ask you about real estate in China today. But first, let's take a look at some of your work, Jin, because you have some of the most iconic buildings in the world, and you've truly changed the skyline in Beijing. Take a look. You've also, really beautiful. You've also worked, obviously, with the incredible Zaha Hadid, which we're going to get to. But I love what you said once. You said, I understand that when we build something, these buildings will outlive us. It's very important, the architecture of the building. Tell us your theory around building.
So when I began to build, I realized that we always have an immediate need to build an office building or an apartment building, a hotel, and the plan is always very functional driven. But actually, there is a culture part for that work, which is the architecture. And whatever building we build, they form the face of our cities, and they stay for long. I realized that these architectures, today when you go around the world to see history, what do you see? A lot of it is architecture. You go to China you see the Great Wall. It was built as a defense. You go to Paris, you go to see Eiffel Tower. You come to this city, you go to see Empire State Building. So these are, at the time, built for different reasons, but they all form our city's face. So once I realized that, I paid a lot more attention to architecture. And then I thought a lot about what kind of architecture would embody today's spirit. Do I want to build, in China, for instance, we had a beautiful courtyards, right? Is this something I can build? Repeat the old architecture? And then realize there are few things that's the character of us, of our time today. One is talents are globalized. We can work with pretty much any talents around the world. And then materials, building materials are so readily available to do any shape that you want that 20 years ago wasn't possible. 20 years ago, we couldn't build any building that are round-shaped, fluid-shaped. Today, we can do all of that because with all the computer designing and material availability. So that's what I decided. I thought, okay, what I would like to do, because I can speak English, I should really get out of China to work with the talents around the world, bring them to China. And that's how I met Zaha Hadid.
Tell us about Zaha Hadid, who passed away last year.
That's right, yeah.
One of her buildings is still being built.
I know, yeah. So Zaha Hadid passed away last year. She was a phenomenal woman, the best architect of our time, despite being a woman, because this is a very man-dominated career, but she was just the best. I met her 14 years ago, and our collaboration began then. She was a woman with incredible courage. She's an Iraqi woman, lived in London, and working in a very man-dominated world. She was denied success for a long time. She would usually when you do architecture design, you go through competition. She would always win competition, but never get built. So for 10 years, she was a paper architect. She drawed a lot and designed a lot, never get built. Now, when I met her, she built teeny little things.
Right.
So 14 years ago, and then we decided to build, and together, she designed and I built about 1.5 million square feet.
Wow.
A lot of buildings.
Let's take a look at one such right now. We'll wait for that video. While they pull that up, let me ask you to characterize real estate today.
Sure.
Xin, because there's a real debate whether or not things are getting overheated again. Would you build and put new money into real estate in the U.S. today?
Well, U.S. real estate today is very hot. It's expensive. The time to get in was a few years ago. When I came into this country and invested in the buildings, it was back in 2009 and 2010. Today, you have, because interest rate has been running at so low for so long, so that has driven the asset prices up so much so that I think it's too expensive to invest.
Are you expecting a big sell-off and a come down in the U.S.?
No, I don't expect that. I do expect this asset price to stay at this high for quite a bit of a time.
What about China?
China's a different story. China as of January 1st this year, we have a capital control, meaning that money cannot flow in and out so easily in order to keep the exchange rate stable. But what it also means is that money from China cannot get out to invest elsewhere. So money keeps on reinvesting in China. And typically, Chinese money always likes to put in to reinvest in real estate. So real estate prices are also very high in China. I think real estate everywhere is expensive today.
Yeah, you just wonder how that plays out and whether or not it's going to come down in a big way and cause a real disruption in the global economy. It doesn't seem like you believe that too.
Well, I think the U.S. economy is very strong. China's still growing at close to 7% GDP per year. I don't see a collapse of real estate market. I do see this is a time to be patient. If you have a real estate, it's great. You're holding a high price asset. But if you don't have, you want to invest, and this is time to wait.
Tell me, Zhang, today President Trump is meeting with President Xi at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. These are two very different individuals. I don't think President Xi plays golf. You don't see him out and about and talking a lot the way you see our president. What are you expecting out of that meeting? What would you like to see these two talk about in terms of relations between the U.S. and China?
I think the U.S.-China relations since Trump administrations have been very closely watched by Chinese in China, because since Nixon established U.S.-China relations, this relationship has operated under one assumption, that is recognizing China is one, not two, not recognizing Taiwan independently and China. So mainland China and Taiwan as a one-country policy, that's what they said it. So when Trump was elected, first thing he did is he said, why should we be sticking to one country policy? Now that freaked out the whole Chinese.
That was a big deal.
And luckily, 2 months later, I think he changed his mind. He realized one China policy is still important, and he reassured the world that he'll continue with that. So I think that paved the way for this meeting to take place. I think when they meet tomorrow or the day after, two things that are important. For the US, obviously, is the North Korean. For Chinese, is the trade. Because Trump was elected with the promise of bringing the jobs back to the US. And that means what? And China and US, if you look at the last 20 years, this has been the most complementary economy in terms of partnership. United States had a lot of capital. China had a lot of labor. China needed the capital. United States needs to invest the capital. So that has been very easy marriage, partnership. But by doing so, China has become the factory of the world. And it's taken a lot of the jobs away. But as a result, it produces a lot of cheap stuff, which benefits the rest of the world. So if you want to reverse that trend, well, first of all, I don't know if it is possible to reverse that trend, because that's just a natural for any manufacturer to go to a place that's cheaper to produce. But I think that's very much the issue. Trump has been talking about increasing the tariffs, imposing the tariffs so that it will make the Chinese export to the US more expensive. We'll see how that plays out.
Are you optimistic about this relationship?
I think you have two men who all want to show who is stronger.
Yeah.
It usually is a tough game.
Zhang, thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.